Alright guys, let's be honest. I have the best Cine4 picture profile in all of YouTube. I get messages from you guys every single day telling me how much you love the settings and the LUTs and how your colors finally look awesome, but I realized I never actually made a video talking about how to expose this picture profile. So today I'm going to walk you guys through my exposure process to hopefully help you get the most out of my Cine4 settings. Welcome back to the channel, Filmmaking homies. If you don't already know, it's your boy Cody Blue, and we're back in the office today talking about how to expose your footage when you're shooting with my custom Cine4 picture profile. Now, if you guys are new to the channel and you're looking for the best picture profile for your Sony camera, I'll go ahead and leave a link to that video up here for you guys, but be warned, it's an older video and it kinda makes me cringe a little bit. Now, before we start talking about how to properly expose when you're shooting with my Cine4 settings or any other Cine4 settings, let's give you guys a quick rundown on the different ways that you can actually change your exposure when you're shooting video. So the first thing that I want to mention when it comes to changing your exposure for video is the fact that you need to be shooting in manual exposure mode. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about this later on in the video, but basically you need to be shooting in manual so that you have full 100% control of your exposure all the time. Now, I shoot probably 95% of my footage outdoors during daylight hours, whether that's the middle of the day or sunrise or sunset. And the way that I'm changing my exposure almost all of the time is by using my variable ND filter. Now, I have a full video talking about ND filters, so I'm not gonna get into all the details, but basically I just put this on the front of my lens and I turn it one way to make my image darker, and I turn it the other way to make my image brighter. Obviously, if you're finding that your footage is too dark, you can either take your ND filter off or move on to the second exposure method. The second way to change your exposure is gonna be to change your ISO. So if you want a brighter image, use an ISO like 6400, and if you want a darker image, use a lower ISO like ISO 200, which is actually the minimum ISO that you can use when you're shooting in Cine4. Now, going back to the ND filter thing, if I'm shooting in the sun and I'm gonna go into the shade for a quick second, instead of taking my ND filter off, I'll actually just crank my ISO a little bit to 400 or 640 or something like that, because it saves me a lot of time. Instead of taking my ND filter off and putting it on and taking it off, it's quicker to just crank my ISO, and I know that the A7 III does really well at higher ISOs, so I'm not too worried about it. The third way to change your exposure is going to be to adjust your aperture. So use larger apertures like f1.8 for a brighter image, and use smaller apertures like f16 for a darker image. But one thing to keep in mind is this is going to affect your depth of field. So this might not be the best way to change your exposure depending on the type of shot that you're actually going for. Now, in general, when you're shooting video, you want your shutter speed to be 1 over double your frame rate. This is going to give you the best looking motion blur and make sure that your footage looks cinematic. But if you're in a pinch, say you want to shoot at f1.8 and you don't have an ND filter, or maybe you forgot your ND filter, you can go ahead and crank your shutter up to darken your image. Now, this isn't the best method and it can make your footage look a little bit stuttery, but in most cases it's gonna do the job and people won't usually notice. In fact, that mountain biking video that you guys saw on my channel, I shot the whole thing by cranking my shutter because I was running around, I was in the shade, I was in the sun, I was riding my bike with one hand holding my gimbal, and it was crazy, and I didn't want to deal with the whole ND filter thing. Plus, it wasn't for a client, it was just for fun. So I cranked shutter, and you know what? Not a single person left any comments talking about, dude, why did you crank shutter in this video? It looks terrible. Not a single person said anything like that. So I wouldn't really worry about it, and if you're in a pinch, feel free to crank your shutter a little bit. So those are the main ways that you can change your exposure when you're shooting video. Of course, you could always physically add or remove light, but if we're shooting outdoors in a run and gun situation, usually we don't have that option. So now let's talk about how to properly expose my Cine4 picture profile. In general, when you're shooting Cine4, you want a nice, natural, and even exposure. You don't want it to be overexposed and you don't want it to be underexposed, but I am always always exposing for my subject. My subject is gonna be whatever I want the viewer to look at. So if I'm shooting a shot of my girlfriend, obviously I want the viewer to look at my girlfriend. And when I'm exposing that shot, I wanna make sure my girlfriend looks good before I worry about anything else looking good. The same thing goes if my subject is a sunset. I'm gonna make sure that sunset looks good before I worry about if everything else looks good. Of course, I try to protect my highlights as best as I can, but my subject is always priority number one. Now, if you have a nice evenly lit scene, maybe you're in the shade or you have a nice overcast day. I love overcast days because they're super easy to expose. You can pretty much just set your meter to 0 and go ahead and shoot with those settings. But a lot of the times the meter can kind of play tricks on us when we're shooting towards light or away from light. So it's not always a reliable source when it comes to exposing your footage. For example, in this shot, obviously Victoria is my subject. Now the camera thinks that this is a good exposure. My meter says 0, the camera thinks everything is fine, when in reality I actually need to increase my exposure quite a bit to about plus 1.7 in order to get a good exposure on my subject. So going back to the reason why we need to use manual settings is because if we were using automatic settings, our camera is going to underexpose this shot every single time. So you need to shoot manual so that you can manually increase your exposure to get a good exposure of your subject. Now you'll notice that I am losing quite a bit of highlight detail in this shot, but I don't really have a choice. Either I lose that highlight detail or I'm going to have a crappy exposure of my subject. And what I really care about is whether or not my subject looks good. So how do you make sure you're getting a good exposure of your subject? So to be completely upfront with you guys, usually when I'm exposing my footage, I just look at my screen and I ask myself, does my subject look good? Is my subject too dark? Is my subject too bright? Or do I have a nice even exposure on my subject? Now this probably isn't the best way to go about it, especially if you're a beginner, but I think a lot of more experienced videographers kind of do this same thing. We just kind of look at the screen, see if it looks good, and hit record. Now of course I'm keeping an eye on my highlights with my zebra set to 100 plus, just to see if I can save some of those highlights. So it's a little bit of a balancing act between, does my subject look good, and am I saving as much highlights as possible? Fortunately, Cine4 has quite a bit of dynamic range, so you can bring your shadows up a little bit and bring your highlights down a little bit. So if I can save my highlights by bringing my exposure down just a tiny bit, then I'll bring that down and then I'll bring my shadows back up in post in order to save a little bit of highlights. Now one of the best tools that you can use for your exposure is false color. If I'm not just looking at my screen or if I'm unsure about my exposure, I'm checking my false color every single time, especially when I'm shooting footage of people. Skin tones will almost always fall between 50 and 70 IRE under normal exposure conditions, which for Cine4 we want to expose normally. So I'll use this tool a lot to check my skin tones and basically eliminate any sort of guessing. I don't have to wonder if my skin tones are right. I can just check false color really quick, see that they're in the right color range, and I know my skin tones are good. It also comes in handy when you're shooting things other than people, like landscapes or anything like that, because it gives you an idea of your entire image. I can see all of my highlights, I can see where exactly my highlights are blowing out, I can see where I might be losing details in my shadows, whereas with zebras, you really only get one option. You can either check your highlights or you can check your skin tones, or I guess you could check your shadows, but it doesn't really give you the full picture that you get with false color. Now, speaking of zebras, you can use zebras to help you expose your Cine4 footage if you don't have a monitor that has false color. So if you're worried about your highlights, set your zebras to 100 plus and protect them as best as you can without underexposing the rest of your image. Now, if you're filming a person as your subject, you can set a custom zebra to 65 plus or minus 5, and then when you're exposing your footage, you want to see just a tiny bit of zebras on your subject's face, and you'll know that you have your skin tones exposed properly. Overall, there's no one correct way to expose every single scene. You can't just set your meter to 0 and expect to have a perfect exposure every single time. It's going to depend on your lighting and the way you want your scene to look and what you're actually exposing for. Take this shot for example. Do I want to expose for my subject that's in the foreground, or do I want to underexpose a little bit so that everybody can see the beautiful sunset behind her? As a creator, I have to make that choice. Would I rather everybody see the person in the foreground or the sunset in the background? Personally, for this shot, I think it looks pretty cool being able to see the sunset. The point is, the meter on my camera can't tell me how to expose this scene because it doesn't know the look that I'm going for. At the end of the day, when it comes to exposing my Cine4 settings or any other Cine4 settings, you want to try to have a nice, normal, and even exposure across the board. So you're gonna have to go ahead and use your eyes as well as a combination of the other tools that we talked about in order to determine which exposure is best for your scene. When in doubt, just expose your footage so that it looks good on your screen. So there you go, guys. That's how you expose my custom Cine4 settings, keeping in mind that your subject is going to be the most important aspect of your shot. I wish there was an easy way for me to just tell you guys, set your meter to 0 and your exposure is gonna be perfect every single time. But unfortunately, it's not that easy, and if it was, everybody would be a filmmaker. So that's all I have for you guys today, but hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, give me a thumbs up, subscribe if you want to see more. If you have any questions, send them to me on Instagram. But until next time, we'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace out. Have yourselves a great week.